Down through history, there have been all kinds of people who have chosen to oppose God. One of the most notorious was a famous French philosopher. His name was Voltaire. Don't know if you've ever heard that name before, but just to give you a sampling here. In 1764, Voltaire made this statement. He said, "The Bible, that is what fools have written, what imbeciles commend, what rogues teach, and young children are made to learn by heart." But perhaps his most audacious statement was when he made this particular boast. He said, 100 years from my day, there will not be a Bible on earth except one that is looked upon by an antiquarian curiosity seeker. Well, how did that play out? Voltaire died in 1778. He passed into history while Christianity lives on. In fact, it was only 58 years after his death that the Geneva Bible Society was using his former residence as a storehouse for the Bibles and gospel tracts which Voltaire so vehemently opposed. What's that tell us? You fight with God, you lose. Did you bring a Bible today? We're going to drop anchor, at least initially, in Exodus chapter 5, and then we'll speed through a few passages here, spend some time in chapter 8, touch on a variety of sections, Exodus 5 through 10, but I'd encourage you, if you have access, to follow along, track along with me. Our sermon series, of course, is Road Trip, so we're learning life lessons from this book of Exodus. Exodus, of course, is the second book of what we call the Pentateuch. You familiar with that terminology? Penta just means five, tukah, scrolls. So the initial 5 scrolls of the Old Testament, of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This is sometimes also called the Torah. That just means law. That's the Hebrew word for law. Let me give you a quick recap. We are witnessing a birth in this book of Exodus. It's the birth of a nation. The delivery room is Egypt, and the people of God will be birthed from Egypt into the wilderness, ultimately to a place called Canaan, a land of their own. Births are always exciting, aren't they? But births are also messy and painful too, right? And we've already witnessed that throughout this account. The Hebrew people, you recall, went into Egypt as a family, right? A family of 70 people. Now, roughly 400 years later, they number in the neighborhood of over 2 million people. So exponential growth, which led to problems, right? We've seen it already in our study. That's why Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, perceives them as a threat, and he begins to oppress them, even going so far as to murder those baby boys. Does anybody remember this particular Pharaoh's name? Dipstick. Very good. We cannot lose the core tenets of our study, okay? We need to hang on and be reviewing those. Very good. The overall theme of Exodus is one of redemption, how God delivered the Israelites and made them a special people. And we've already noted that this book can be divided into 4 great themes: domination, liberation, revelation, and identification. We're still in the section where God's people are being dominated by Egypt. So that's all by way of review. Now, as we move forward, let's begin to set the stage here. When we last left Moses, God had commissioned him with a very challenging assignment. Remember it? There it is in chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. God says, "And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." And you can probably recall Moses wasn't incredibly excited about the job description, right? And so as a result, he began to offer up a long list of excuses, the result of which is that the Lord consented to Aaron, Moses' brother, to accompany him and to speak for him. Which brings us now to chapter 5, where Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh with those famous words, "Let my people go." Here's how it's spelled out in verse 1. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response here is critical to our purposes today. Look what he comes back with in verse 2. Who is the Lord? Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. I say that's critical because you can almost hear God responding now. Oh, you don't know me, huh? All right then, let me show you. Let me show you who I am. And Pharaoh will now learn the hard way that there's one God and only one. He would have never let the Jews go on his own. After all, why give up all that free slave labor, right? In fact, instead of letting them go, you can see there, a little bit further into chapter 5, how he treated them even more harshly, right? By making the Israelites supply their own materials, while at the same time demanding the same quota of bricks. Obviously, it's going to take something supernatural to change his mind. And that's why God intervenes. God intervenes in order to convince Pharaoh to release his people. And to do that, the Lord will unleash a whole series of plagues upon the land. These plagues, actually 10 in number, occur in a very specific, definite order. And so, for example, the first 3, blood, frogs, and gnats, bring great discomfort. The second triad, flies, cattle, and boils, bring great destruction. And the final 3 leading up to the 10th, which we'll cover next week, hail, locusts, and darkness, bring great devastation. You can see even there from that very basic survey that there's an increase in severity, right? Gets worse as we move down that list. And so what starts with blood and frogs ends up in darkness and death until eventually Pharaoh caves in and decides to cooperate. Now keep in mind, this is a different Pharaoh than we saw in chapter 2. What was his name again? Dipstick. Yeah, this is not Dipstick. The Pharaoh is a title. That's not his first name. Think of like ruler or king or monarch. Pharaoh is a title, okay? So now here in chapter 8, we actually have Dipstick's cousin, okay? His name is Dimwit, okay? You want to hang on to that one, write it on your outline, Dimwit, and you'll see why momentarily. I have no idea if he was his cousin. I'm just making that stuff up. But his name really was Dimwit. I know that for a fact, okay? One more preliminary question. Why would God do this? Why would God send 10 plagues upon these people? Well, I've already alluded to it, but their purpose is explicitly stated in chapter 7, verses 2 through 5. God says, "You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. And then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites, and the Egyptians will know. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it." Stated succinctly, to defeat, God is doing this. He's sending these plagues to defeat the gods of Egypt, to display his power, and to deliver his people. And that's why we're calling the message today, the Battle of the Gods. Throughout our study, Pharaoh is actually going to provide a negative example. And so we want to learn from his mistakes today. That makes sense? He's providing a negative example on how not to respond to God. And so we'll see 3 warnings. If you're following along on the outline that was handed to you on the way into the building today. 3 warnings in this text issued to Pharaoh, and yet I believe they're just as timely for us this morning. Let's see. The first one is this: God issues this warning: tear down all your idols. The Egyptians were polytheistic. Many, theism, gods, many gods. They worshipped all kinds of false gods. And since that was the case, the Lord Almighty will now defeat them in a battle so public that it could not be denied. In fact, just fast forward momentarily. You see the verse there on the screen. I think it makes it very clear, chapter 12, verse 12, where God says, I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. I mean, that's just stated in black and white terms. The God of Israel is about to face off against the gods of Egypt. It was many gods versus the one true God. Now, what the casual reader of the Bible often misses is that these plagues weren't just arbitrary events. I mean, God just didn't pick these things willy-nilly out of the air, okay? They were specifically designed to humiliate the Egyptian deities. I've already said the Egyptians worshiped some 80 different gods. And I don't have time to break it down into great detail today, but each plague then is a refutation of a specific Egyptian god, false god. So, for example, that first plague, turning the Nile to blood, was a judgment against Apis, the god of the Nile, Isis, the goddess of the Nile, and Num, the guardian of the Nile. The Nile was also believed to be the bloodstream of Osiris, who was reborn each year when the river flooded. The second plague, bringing frogs from the Nile, was a judgment against Heket, the frog-headed goddess of birth. We'll learn more about that in just a second. The third plague, gnats, was a judgment on Set, the god of the desert, and on you could go. You see the pattern, right? GotQuestions.org. Go to GotQuestions.org, type in the 10 plagues in the search engine. It'll bring up all the false gods. You can read and study that for yourself. But you get the idea. Now, it would be real easy for us to shake our heads, right? And think, how incredibly primitive. I cannot believe people can be characterized by such superstition and idolatry. But I would just want to caution you from making those kind of snap judgments today. If I were to ask you this question, what idol is the greatest rival to God's unchallenged reign in your life? How would you respond? Some of you might immediately dismiss the question. You'd think, well, Pastor Gary must be talking to somebody else. Because I don't bow down to images of wood and stone. I've never chanted before the statue of a false god. No, I suppose most of you haven't. But here's the reality. All sin begins with some form of idolatry. John Calvin put it like this. He said, our hearts are an idol factory. Years ago, I did a sermon series on that subject of idolatry, and I discovered in that study that idolatry is not just an issue in the Bible, it is the issue. Idolatry is essentially mentioned in every book of the Bible. There are thousands of verses that reference the topic, over 50 commands in the first 5 books alone. It's the number one issue in the Bible, the number one stumbling block for believers. And we're going to see that surface later in our study, this book of Exodus, right? But maybe a definition will help. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones put it like this. He said, an idol is anything in my life that occupies a place that should be occupied by God alone. An idol is something that holds such a controlling position in my life that it moves and rouses and attracts me so easily that I give my time, attention, and money to it effortlessly. Likewise, Tim Keller, in his book entitled Counterfeit Gods, he made this statement. He said, what then is an idol? It is anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give. And so really the possibilities are endless, aren't they? An idol is whatever or whoever you and I give central value to in our lives. We can easily become consumed with a career, or with making money, with athletic achievements, with our social standing, We can easily be consumed with achieving a perfect family or a romantic relationship, physical beauty, superior intelligence. Things like sex, power, control, happiness can all become false gods. And what happens is these counterfeit gods drive us into the ground as we try to appease them and to satisfy and chase them. So here's what it comes down to, gang. We need to worship God and God alone. That's really the point. And we're going to see that even more clearly when we get to Exodus 20 and God begins to spell out his law. But he alone is worthy of our worship, and he will not tolerate any challenges for the throne of our hearts. But I'll just be real honest with you today. My fear is that too many believers are compromising these days. And they rationalize along these lines. They say, well, if I'm serving God over here, what difference does it make how I live the rest of my life? But here's the reality. God will not share your allegiance with the world. He will not share your allegiance with the flesh. Only a complete break with your past, only leaving the gods of Egypt fully behind will bring healing in your life. If we're to break free from the bondage of sin, we need to love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Warning number 1, eliminate all idols. Tear down all false gods. Closely related to that would be warning number 2, stop compromising with sin. Instead of trying to analyze every one of these 9 plagues, it would be impossible to do in a half-hour sermon, I thought we'd focus on one of them that's representative of what you would discover in the other 9. Is that okay? So we're going to pick up the account now over in chapter 8. If you want to go that direction with me, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so that they may worship me. And if you refuse to let them go, I'm going to send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They'll come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. The frogs will come up on you and your people and all your officials. That is what you call a riveting conversation. And as I've already mentioned, these plagues aren't arbitrary events. They're designed to discredit the Egyptian deities. One of the most beautiful temples for worship in Egypt was devoted to the ugliest goddess. Heket was depicted, you see it there. She's depicted as having the body of a woman and the head of a frog. Nice. So you can see, it's obvious, isn't it? Plague 2 is a direct confrontation now to her power specifically. Verse 5, the Lord spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron hopped right to it. I got 1 million of them today, okay? Verse 6, so Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. Now watch this. This is interesting. But the magicians, so these are the guys who work for Pharaoh now, right? The magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. And I'm just trying to figure out the thought process here. I don't know about you. You know, that's what we need when there's a plague. More of it, right? Let's bring more frogs into the equation. But make sure you don't miss it. The only thing they can do is imitate the plague, right? They can't eradicate it. You see that? They don't have the power. They don't have the authority to take it away. So try to imagine what that would be like. Big frogs, little frogs, frogs in the yard, frogs in the palace. Everywhere you step, squish, squish, squish. You come home at night, open the fridge, there's a frog. There are frogs in the closets, frogs in the cupboards, frogs in the bathtub. You put your hand in your pocket, there's a frog. You get ready to go to bed at night, pull back the covers, and there's a bunch of cold, slimy, slippery frogs. Everywhere you look, there are frogs, frogs, and more frogs. Are you getting the picture? And all of these frogs made Pharaoh want to croak. I told you I had a million of them this morning. So not surprisingly, verse 8, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Moses comes back with, "I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile." See what Moses is saying there, Pharaoh? You tell me. You tell me when you want the frogs to stop. Now, why would he do that? Because Moses wants him to understand that God is calling the shots. The Lord's in charge of every territory, including Egypt. He's telling Pharaoh, you can't control this. Your magicians can't change it. You tell me. You tell me when you want God to stop it. And now we have arguably the most amazing answer given anywhere in the Bible. I mean, how would you respond to Moses in that situation if you were Pharaoh? The obvious answer that you would expect, right? How about now? How about right now? How about we just get rid of these stupid frogs immediately? But look at what he says. Tomorrow. Are you kidding me? And now you know why his name is Dimwit. This is unbelievable. Tomorrow? All I want is one more night with the frogs? What's he thinking? Does he enjoy frog legs? Is he tired of sleeping alone? Why in the world would you spend another night with the frogs? But you know what? If you stop and analyze it, often we're guilty of doing something very similar. Here's what I mean. Many times there are habits and practices in our lives that we know are not pleasing to God. We know they're having a negative impact on our lives and sometimes even making our lives miserable. And yet we choose to hang on to them, don't we? Sin is like that. I'm guessing you've noticed that. Sin is like that. So when do you want to stop doing that bad, nasty, sinful habit? Tomorrow. Give me just one more night. There are many things that can enslave a person. It can be alcoholism. It can be drugs. It can be pornography. It can be anger. And often the people that are caught in these habits will say, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. I can stop any time I want. In fact, I'm going to stop tomorrow. And then they wake up one day and discover that their whole life has been overrun by frogs. God has the power to help us. We're just too lazy to call the frog exterminator. We hope that if we just ignore them, they'll go away on their own. But they never do. They just keep multiplying and jumping into every area of our lives, stinking things up. God is willing to call up the frogs, not tomorrow, today. And he has the power to do it. You do not need to spend one more minute with the frogs. So we're going to tear down our idols. We're going to stop compromising with sin. Thirdly, we're going to beware of superficial repentance. I'm guessing many of you picked up on a phrase I read earlier in chapter 7. And that's where the Lord says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart." A lot of people raise questions about that particular phrase. They find it bothersome. And so they'll ask something along these lines. They'll say, it doesn't seem fair for God to harden Pharaoh's heart and then to punish him for being disobedient. Well, let me take a stab at that, see if I can respond. Look what happens after the frogs are dealt with. We're back in chapter 8 now, verse 15. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. If you were to go through the entire account of Exodus, you would find something along the lines of 18 references. 18 references that speak to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. In about half of them, God does the hardening, and in the other half, Pharaoh does the hardening. But what's interesting is that the Bible seems to indicate that Pharaoh initiated the process. You with me? Pharaoh alone was the agent of hardening in each of the first 5 plagues. In other words, Pharaoh made his choice, and then God comes along and confirms him in that choice. So it's almost like, okay, if that's the direction you're determined to go, then so be it. Somebody has stated it like this. They said, the same sunshine that softens wax hardens the clay. So the rays of God's grace shine upon all mankind, but we each individually make the determination what we'll do and how we'll respond to that grace. Rather than letting the work of God soften his heart, Pharaoh determined to go the other direction. Thomas Holcraft, in his commentary, puts it like this. The withdrawal of God's Spirit from one's heart and life results in hardening. But God's Spirit does not withdraw until he is forced to do so by the stubborn sinfulness of the one from whose heart he has been driven. Every plague gave Pharaoh one more chance to repent. Every plague gave him one more opportunity to submit to God. In fact, if you read through this section, you'll find a couple of places where Pharaoh said, I have sinned. One time he went so far as to say he asked God for forgiveness. And yet ultimately, he hardened his heart. So apparently he was saying the right words, but there wasn't any sincerity behind them. The problem was not a matter of knowledge, but of the will. God gave him 9 opportunities to save himself and his people. Unfortunately, he didn't do it. And that leads us to this solemn truth. Light received leads to more light. Light rejected only to the darkness. And that's why that 9th plague is so terrifying, because that deep darkness that will cover Egypt portrays the deep darkness inside Pharaoh's heart. After the 9th plague, Pharaoh and Moses are at an impasse. There's nothing left to say or to do. Pharaoh has made his choice. He knows the truth, but he doesn't care. And what a frightening position to be in. It's a sobering passage, isn't it? For those of us who have grown up in the church, for those of us who have attended Sunday morning worship for years, and all the truth that we've been exposed to over that time, are we allowing it to penetrate our hearts? Are we submitting to that truth? Or do we know the truth and just don't care? And even more so, for me, as I'm studying and preparing this week, thinking, I've not only been brought up in the church and attended every Sunday morning my entire life, but I've also taught this truth. So there's even a greater accountability for me, and that sends Pastor Gary to his knees. It's the same way with many foxhole prayers and desperate pleas from a sickbed. Under duress, many people promise God anything if only he'll help them. But once the crisis is over, they slip right back into their old patterns. They promise and then renege on that promise. But this message is not just to them. It's also, as I've already indicated, for you and me. We need to beware of superficial repentance, of just going through the motions and saying what we think needs to be said. The 10 plagues stand as a warning to all of us. Over in the New Testament, the author of the epistle to Hebrews records 3 times those words that I read from Psalm 95 at the very outset of the service this morning. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Don't harden your hearts as God's people did in the rebellion. The root of unbelief is in the heart, not the head. Any heart can become hardened when we resist God, when we say no to God. We need to pray for hearts that are tender and sensitive to the Spirit's voice. Here's how Ray Pritchard summarized it. He said, God intends to make his name great in both judgment and mercy through these awful plagues. They are missional in the deepest sense because they reveal God's supremacy, they display God's judgment, they demonstrate God's glory, and they point to God's mercy. Pharaoh could have repented at any moment. Let that be a lesson to all of us. Bottom line today, in the end, we must all choose our God. And the God we choose will either save us or destroy us. If you prefer the gods of this world, you will die with them. But if you choose Christ, you will still be glad you did 10,000 times, 10,000 years from now. God brings down the high and mighty, and he sets the captives free. If we miss that truth, we have missed the message of the 10 plagues. We can stand with the people of God and be saved, or we can follow Pharaoh to our own destruction. The year was 1974, so it's almost 30 years now after World War II has ended. But in the jungle of the Philippines, a guy by the name of Lieutenant Hirao Onada, at age 52, was still fighting the war. 30 years after the fact, he surrendered his sword to President Ferdinand Marcos. Onada had fought World War II on the 74 square mile island of Laban, not knowing that the war had ended and peace had been made for decades. And there was all kinds of attempts to contact this guy. They used loudspeakers. They dropped off leaflets. They sent in search parties. They even an offer of $400,000. And it did not persuade him to surrender. When he finally did, reporters asked what had happened during those 30 years on the island. And his response was, nothing. Nothing pleasant happened to me in all those years. Lieutenant Onada is a perfect illustration of what spiritual stubbornness looks like. He resisted. He refused to surrender. He would not submit. And he missed all those years, the richest years of his life. The same can be true of us. If we resist God's voice, just like Voltaire, just like Pharaoh, if we fight with God, we lose. How much better? How much better to submit to him? How much better to maintain a tender, pliable heart towards his truth? How much better to pray, God, I want you to have your way in my heart and life. Cast down every idol and submit exclusively to you. There's an old hymn that expresses those sentiments. We're going to blow the dust off it this morning and sing a few of those verses as we wrap up. I encourage you to sing it as a prayer. Think about what you're expressing to the Lord. Think about what you're saying. Does it come from a heart that's sincere this morning? So we express this to him. We stand as Gerald leads us.